Good evening. Welcome to Glendora Perspective. I'm Lois Shade.
And I'm Diane Michelson. We kind of switched places there for
we
tonight.
did. We're giving Lois more practice.
We are so pleased to have with us this evening, and we had him in the past, Michael Archer. He's an author of 2 wonderful books about firefighting. If we could get a close-up of those, Richard, and show his books. I have a helicopter pilot's son that's thoroughly enjoying reading them. And
I have a grandson that's lining up to read them.
Good for you.
Yeah.
Welcome, and tell us a little about your background before we get into this issue.
Okay. Well, my background is I'm a wildfire consultant. I work with a nonprofit over in Topanga Canyon called Wildfire Research Network. I've been on TV like this show. KABC has had me on asking me questions about the 747 supertanker. Associated Press calls on a regular basis when we have a fire asking questions, so I get around on fires.
Sounds like you've got a lot of knowledge behind you.
Yeah.
And this tragic fire that they just contained and the lives lost in that, could that have been prevented?
Yes. I feel at least the lives could have been saved on that if they'd acted in a different way.
Well, maybe you can explain some of this to us.
Okay, I will.
Okay. It's all yours.
Okay. Well, in essence, we have a dilemma because there is an aircraft that could help out a great deal, but it does not have a contract to do so, and as a result, you've probably heard of the movie 4 Weddings and a Funeral. Well, I called this 4 Funerals and a Wedding because 4 firefighters died that first day because one of the pilots was at a wedding in Cleveland. They hadn't called him in for the fire, and the reason was because they didn't have a seasonal contract. So as a result of that, this aircraft, the DC-10 or 10 tanker,
he's not showing it right now, but in a moment.
He's working on it.
Okay.
Is not really in the cards right now because they haven't given it a full year contract. As a result of this, the pilot and crew were missing the day of the Esperanza fire because there had been no call put in. It's on an on-call basis for California Department of Forestry, but they made no mention of the fact that they wanted the pilot and co-pilot there. So when the fire started going, the pilot was in Cleveland for a wedding and the co-pilot was in Texas. So they had to call him back.
There were some comments the other morning on KFI, and I'm kind of trying to go from memory. They were saying, Bill Handel was saying something about we have these planes sitting here. They could be used for firefighting. There's no contract.
Right.
The guys who own the planes, the big 747s, have no guarantee that they're going to be able to pay for these planes.
Right.
So they're reverting back to
Cargo use. Yeah. In fact, the 747, I talked to the folks at Evergreen that produced the 747, and they were saying, yeah, we're in the process of converting back to cargo use now because the contract they had, which they'd really fought hard to get a contract with the U.S. Forest Service, that contract is now null and void because they have a preparedness level much like Homeland Security. Once that preparedness level for fires went to a certain lower level, the contract disappeared. And so as a result, they no longer have a contract to fly the fires, so they said, we can earn $180,000 a day flying cargo, so why keep it as a firefighting aircraft that's sitting here doing nothing with no contract when we can be making that much money?
And they have no guarantee that they're ever going to have a contract. They wait for a fire to happen, hope it's bad enough that they'll be called on.
Well, the contract has to happen before the fire happens. So as a result, they say it'll probably be springtime before they can even try to go after a contract again. So from now, which is our fire season, the worst part of the fire season for us, until next April, the plane's not even going to be available. Even if they had a fire and they called them up, they said it'd take 3 days to convert it back to firefighting if they even decided to.
The federal government, the Forest Service, pick up the tab for these wildfires?
They were supposed to, yeah, and they have. And if there's a disaster area declared, like for the Day fire up by Ojai, then the 70-odd million that they had to pay for that, which was mostly paid by local agencies to begin with, is now part of the federal government's bill that they have to pay. Your taxpayer dollars at work.
Is there ever been any cost analysis, you know, the way we do it now versus maybe what it would cost if we were as you call it, more efficient with the 747s?
They haven't done it as far as what they could do, but they have done projections of how much it would have cost if there hadn't been like a fire department available to do something. And the cost goes into the billions, especially with real estate around this area.
You have some interesting articles there.
Yeah.
Yes.
It costs the federal government whenever there's a lawsuit. For instance, right now there's a lawsuit going on for the folks that lost homes in the Cedar Fire, which was down in San Diego.
Richard.
Back in 2003, if you'll recall, we had fires all over the place, including in San Diego. Cedar Fire was the worst. It killed several people, including a firefighter, and a fire captain was badly burned, much like what happened on the Esperanza fire. And as a result of homeowners being concerned that not enough was done to prevent the fire from reaching their homes, they're filing a lawsuit of $236 million against the fire officials. So this is one way that they pay money if the lawsuit is a favorable ruling for the homeowners. This is the cost that they estimate for the fires so far this year, which is $1.5 billion.
Billion. That's a
Billion. That's a big one.
For the U.S. Forest Service that they've had to pay out for wildfires this year.
In California or nationwide?
Nationwide.
Nationwide.
This has been the worst fire season on record this year. The reason you haven't heard about it has been because there have been so many other crises in the news that the newscast simply didn't have time to cover it. And as one Forest Service person put it rather sardonically, nobody cares if Bambi dies in a fire. And a lot of these fires may be out in the woods someplace, and so people don't consider the timber loss, the wildlife loss, the vistas that are lost, let alone the cost of suppressing the fire. Every time a plane flies out and drops on it, every time a fire crew goes out on their engine to fight the fire, somebody's paying the bill for it. So $1.5 billion was paid this year just for suppression costs.
With this last fire, you mentioned the pilot was at a wedding and so forth. Would the plane have been ready to fly if they had been here?
Sure.
They're the only ones that could fly it.
Yeah. Yeah, you have two people that can fly that plane.
So if they had been contacted, they might have gotten back soon enough to help save these lives.
Yeah, the guy was at the funeral, at the wedding at the time that they were setting up the funerals for these firefighters, and they brought him back within 24 hours once the fire officials finally put in the call for him. But nobody put in the call, nobody, they knew a red flag day was coming. They said, okay, we've got 2 days of red flags, so we better have somebody standing by. Do you want us to stand by? And the forest officials didn't say anything, so they said, okay, fine, we're out of here.
That's a shame.
Yeah.
Well, I hope he enjoyed his wedding. I hope it's on his conscience for a while.
Well, no, he would have loved to have flown.
He would have wanted to. It wasn't his fault then.
No,
okay.
No. This is one talking about the Washington wildfire, just cleaning up the mess after a wildfire.
Right.
$28 million for the Washington wildfire that just burned up in that area. So even after the fire is out, there's still
Now,
things
how
to
many of
clean
these
up.
fires that we're talking about were set purposely?
Several.
Okay.
And in some cases, people would sort of aid and abet. So, for instance, over in Portugal this summer, they had problems where they had to bring in 400 paratroopers to prevent people from setting fires. They actually had a local crime syndicate that was setting fires. Down in Sydney, Australia, a couple of years ago, they had a gang of teenage kids that were out setting fires on the periphery of the city out there. So people get into this copycat mode. I talked to an inspector for Riverside County Fire Department, and he said that they'd had over 50 fires set in this general area where the Esperanza fire went up since May. And he says it's not all one person, because he had arrested one guy who was impersonating a firefighter setting these fires deliberately.
My son mentioned maybe this last one was set by a firefighter.
It's possible.
Some of them want to fight fires, and the only way to do it is to start one.
Yeah, there's been more than one case where a firefighter has started a fire because they needed the overtime.
They do have a suspect now on this Esperanza fire.
Actually, about